A vicious killing spree in San Antonio triggers an alarming investigation.
They were both shot with a small caliber handgun, both had head wounds, and both were bound.
They realized that these two murders were related to each other.
And we're over here like, oh my God, we might have some kind of serial killer here.
Who was killing these young men? As multiple cases collide, authorities uncover a sordid web of seduction and betrayal.
She lured him over under the pretense of the two of them having sexual relations.
They knew what they were doing. It was planned out.
Had jealousy pushed someone over the edge? Or was something more sinister afoot?
She said, we were like Bonnie and Clyde. These two basically create this perfect killer couple.
Born in 1995 and raised on the southeast side of San Antonio, Antoinette Martinez grew up learning the value of resilience and determination.
She was my role model growing up. She was super cool. She was easygoing, but I also felt bad for Antoinette because she did go through some hardships.
Antoinette was 12 years old when her mother passed away. Her father was unable to care for her, and both Antoinette and her brother had to go live with their aunt.
After her mom passed away, it was traumatic. I know her dad went through some stuff.
Despite her tumultuous childhood, Antoinette remained a beacon of positivity to her friends and family.
She was so popular, and she had all these friends, and I can honestly say there was no party without her. She was always the one that made everybody laugh. If I was crying, I could have been sobbing my eyes out, and she would have made me crack up.
A strong student, Antoinette made plans to further her education after high school by enrolling at a local community college.
She was really smart. She said she was going for accounting, and I know she did have good grades.
Antoinette had dreams of one day attending a traditional four-year university. To save up the money for tuition, she accepted a full-time job at a fast food restaurant in San Antonio.
She was manager there and had recently just gotten her own apartment.
She was proud of herself. This was, I think, her first job, and she was so excited about it. She finally felt like some responsibility.
If an employee called in sick, she would have to go in there and cover the shift. She pretty much did everything over there. At 19, when you're running a very busy store, pretty much by yourself, she was a hard worker.
And it was during her long shifts at work that Antoinette developed a special bond with one of her employees. His name was Cameo Clines.
Cameo and Antoinette are about the same age. They're both in their late teens.
He could be a charismatic person.
Antoinette and Cameo became fast friends in the spring of 2014. In Cameo, Antoinette found a confidant both on the job and outside of work.
At some point, Cameo and Antoinette become more than just friends. They do start having a physical relationship with each other. They had feelings for each other. And you can see that they trusted each other.
He was the big one, the one that the family was talking about, all excited for. Because, it was her growing up finally.
With Cameo by her side, Antoinette felt like she finally had the support she needed to accomplish her goals.
She did enroll into college, and around that time, that's when I had moved away, and I didn't really see her that much after that. But the family would be like, oh, she's getting serious with this guy. I feel like eventually she could have been an owner of a company, she could have been an accountant. She had so many dreams.
But Antoinette's dreams for the future would be derailed by a terrifying crime. June 18th, 2014. At 6:30 a.m., a rancher in Bexar County is checking on his livestock after his wife had noticed some suspicious activity on their land the night before. As the rancher approaches the edge of his property, he makes a gruesome discovery.
He discovers the body of a young man. The body was face down, and it had looked like a gunshot wound to the back of the head.
The rancher immediately contacts the Bexar County Sheriff's Office.
My sergeant notifies me that there is a deceased person that was located on Donop Road. Once myself and Investigator Barrera go out to the scene, that's when we start making our observations and start our investigation.
When authorities arrive on the scene, they confirm the victim had sustained 3 gunshot wounds.
They discovered gunshots, one to the neck and
It's a rural area where there's no traffic, there's little movement as far as vehicles, people. So it's a good spot, you would say, to commit a murder.
There isn't any identification on him, so the police are not able to say who he is.
We knew that he was a Hispanic male.
While the victim's identity remains a mystery, police discover 2 possible clues near the body.
Right next to the deceased body, I noticed a car jack that was aired. It did have some possible blood stains on it.
There was evidence of a trunk liner that was found at the crime scene. There was some evidence of either fibers or even blood that was there as well on that truck liner.
The bloody trunk liner and car jack suggest the victim had been transported to the location by a vehicle. Nearby, police discover more evidence.
Also, we located some what appear to be some tape, like a tan color but shiny, so it's more like packing tape. That did have blood stains on it.
To detectives, it appears the victim may have been bound by the tape and that he had tried to escape his attacker before he was killed.
Several pieces of it were found in different places, so it gave some indication that he was shot probably while trying to get away.
Coming up, a possible witness to the shooting comes forward.
She noticed headlights that were facing like in the direction of her house.
And detectives discover their first clue to their victim's identity.
she told detectives that she had a Facebook conversation, and it made her quite suspicious.
On the morning of June 18, 2014, Bexar County Sheriff's detectives are investigating a deadly shooting. So far, they have been unable to identify their victim.
When they first ran the fingerprints through the system, they could not get a match at the time. Detectives
canvass the area for possible witnesses. They start with the rancher who had discovered the body. He claims that earlier that morning, his wife had been startled awake by a loud noise coming from the field behind their house.
She noticed headlights that were facing like in the direction of her house. She also notices away from the headlights like a flashlight. She goes back to sleep. I think around 6:30 or so in the morning, that's when she notifies her husband to let him know that, hey, I saw some movement back there. Can you go check the area, make sure any of the cows did not break out of the cow pasture?
He gets in his vehicle and drives out to the fence line and apparently discovers the body.
Unfortunately, neither the rancher nor his wife had seen anything else that might identify the perpetrator or the victim. Then, 24 hours later, police in San Antonio receive a call about a missing person. 20-year-old Xavier Cordero.
Cordero worked at a big box clothing store, and there had been a co-worker who notified police to ask for a wellness check because they hadn't seen him at work in a while.
There were some concerned co-workers who had already kind of started looking into where he was because it wasn't something that he would typically do. He was not a no-call, no-show kind of employee.
San Antonio police obtained fingerprint records from Xavier Cordero's employer.
They compared his fingerprints to the fingerprints of the deceased person, and that's when they get the match.
That afternoon, San Antonio detectives notify Xavier's parents that their son's body has been found.
I've done plenty of death notifications, but it's not easy for us, and of course, for the family in itself. We give them time, to process the whole situation. And then our next step after that is to try to get as much information from them that's going to assist us in trying to locate who was responsible for the death of their son. We do ask them if there's anything that's missing, either cell phones or vehicles, anything, that their son might have had that we're not aware of.
Xavier's mom had access to his cell phone plan, and so she was able to give a printout of who he was speaking to.
His mother prints out a phone log for them, and they find that his last phone activity was about 2:20 in the morning on June 18th, which was the night he disappeared.
The family also tells police that Xavier had been driving his black Mitsubishi Lancer when he vanished. Detectives can't help but wonder if the vehicle spotted by the rancher's wife might have been Xavier's car.
They gave us a description of the vehicle and the license plate. Our first step was to put a bolo out for any law enforcement agency, if they locate that vehicle, to contact me.
When detectives ask Xavier's mom for his last known whereabouts, they learn he had been at his girlfriend's house on the night of June 17th.
In this case right here, the mother was very helpful. She did provide us information on his girlfriend at the time. Right before we left, that's when we noticed that a female was showing up at the house. And sure enough, that was the girlfriend.
She tells them that they met on Facebook and been dating about 3 months.
When detectives ask Xavier's girlfriend when she had last seen him, she confirms that he had been over at her house on June 17th.
They were a fairly new relationship. They were spending a lot of time with each other. He would often spend the night there at her house.
They ended up staying at their house till like 2 or 3 in the morning. That's when he suddenly just tells her that he had to leave. She kind of questioned it a little as to why are you leaving? Did not give her a definite answer, but before he left, he told her, I'll see you in the morning.
The next day, she doesn't hear from him or doesn't know where he is. So she begins calling him and texting him and can't get through to him.
That worried her and concerned her because he wasn't somebody who would just stop responding.
So at that point, she begins trying to reach out to friends or contacts on Facebook to see if anybody's seen him. One of the things that she told detectives was that she had a Facebook conversation with a supposed friend of Xavier Cordero, and it made her quite suspicious. He apparently tells her that Cordero's been in jail and there's some things that she doesn't know about him.
Xavier's girlfriend tells police that the person she had reached out to was named Dee, and explains that her conversation with him had made her uncomfortable.
Her concern was at a point that Dee was kind of making it sound to her that he did not know Xavier, which she knew that was false. And then he makes a comment to her that as far as he knew, he was locked up, which is Xavier, which she knew that that wasn't true also. So that in alone, made her feel that, he's not being as truthful as he's supposed to be. So that's why she kind of mentioned it to us, thinking that he might be a possible suspect in this.
Coming up, a crucial piece of evidence surfaces.
They find traces of blood in the trunk.
But the investigation is thrown into a tailspin when police learn of a second gruesome discovery.
There was brown packaging tape around his mouth and around his ankles.
They realized that these two murders were related to each other.
Detectives in Bexar County, Texas, are investigating the shooting death of 20-year-old Xavier Cordero. On June 20th, police get a hit on the bolo they put out on Xavier's missing vehicle.
A San Antonio police officer who's on routine patrol in the strip mall notices turned out to be Cordero's car.
Police tow the vehicle for forensic processing.
We started processing the vehicle in daylight time, doing fingerprints and taking photos. Once nighttime came, that's when we started processing it to see if we get any possible detection of any blood. In this case, we did. Towards the trunk area of the vehicle, we did get some reaction for blood that was recovered and eventually sent to the medical examiner's office for testing.
The trunk liner is also missing, confirming that the liner found at the crime scene had most likely come from Xavier's own car.
Which ultimately corroborated that Xavier Cordero had been placed in the trunk of his own vehicle.
But who would want to kill Xavier? So far, police only have one lead to follow, a friend of Xavier's named Dee, whose behavior seemed suspicious to Xavier's girlfriend. On June 23rd, detectives pay Dee a visit.
I remember going to the apartment complex where Dee supposedly lived at with his girlfriend. Once we do make contact with him, they were being very upfront with us. Mind you, we still don't put our guard down, because a lot of times we've had cases, where people are being super cooperative with us, and then suddenly they're the main suspect.
When detectives pressed Dee about the odd Facebook messages he had sent to Xavier's girlfriend, he claims he was just fooling around, unaware of the severity of the situation. Dee is also able to provide police with an alibi for his whereabouts the night Xavier went missing.
He was giving us as much information as possible, which made me believe, that he was not trying to lie to us. There was nothing that stuck out that would say he's the one that did it at the time.
Next, detectives turn their attention to Xavier Cordero's phone records. They discover that the last call he made was on June 18th at 2:20 a.m., approximately 4 hours before he was found dead.
It was determined that this was one of the last individuals that he had called.
I just called the number. A female answers. I asked her for her name.
The woman identifies herself as Antoinette Martinez.
I asked her, do you know Xavier? Mentioned him by his name, first name and last name, and then she said, yes, I do know him. At that point, I did ask her, oh, I need to get a statement from you. I need you to come into our office. Sure enough, a couple of hours later, we get a call from her that she is at our front desk.
When Antoinette sits down with detectives, she tells them that Xavier Cordero was her friend. She also appears to be shocked when she learns that Xavier is dead.
She was very sorry to hear what happened. She acted surprised, but that she really didn't know anything.
When detectives press Antoinette for details about her relationship with Xavier, she admits that they used to date.
She does say that they had a sexual relationship, but she hadn't seen him in about 3 months.
Antoinette tells police that her intimate relationship with Xavier ended after she began dating her new boyfriend, Cameo Clines. But she and Xavier still remained friends. Antoinette also confirms that she'd received a phone call from Xavier on June 17th.
She gets a call just out of the blue from him mentioning that he wanted to come to her location. So she said, yes, come over.
But Antoinette claims Xavier never showed up.
One of the things she said is that I didn't think nothing of it because sometimes he's done that before where he says, I'm going to be showing up and he doesn't show up. I asked her, do you have anything to do with Xavier being dead? She said, no, I don't have anything to do with it.
While detectives are wary of Antoinette's statement, they have no evidence to hold her.
We kind of finished the questions with her at that time. We had all the contact information, so we just basically, okay, you're good to go right now.
Several days pass without any other leads. Then, on June 30th, detectives receive another disturbing call from rural Bexar County.
There was a man in town visiting the San Antonio area, and he was from New York, and he was just looking at property.
He got out of his car to look around, and that's when he noticed a foul smell. Then he walked closer to where the smell was coming from.
He observed a man's body laying in a field. He determined that the person was deceased and contacted the authorities at that point.
As soon as I get too close to where his body was at, I noticed that he was moderately decomposed. There was no identifying kind of features to his face or anything like that, but I did notice that there was brown packaging tape around his mouth and around his ankles.
It's the same type of tape that had been found near Xavier Cordero's body. And that's not the only similarity between the two murders.
They were both shot with a small caliber handgun, both had head wounds, and both were bound.
They were both young Hispanic males. They were found within 3 miles of each other, dumped in a rural, kind of a remote area in Bexar County, led us to believe that they were possibly connected.
Everything's similar, and we're over here like, oh my God, you know, we might have some kind of serial killer here.
As they survey the second crime scene, detectives receive information on the new victim's possible identity.
At the same time I'm at the crime scene, I'm getting information from SAPD that they had been working a missing person case by the name of Stephen Rendon. So as they're giving me description of what he was last seen alive in, I'm actually looking at his body at the crime scene, and it's matching up to what he was last seen wearing. At that point, we knew we had a tentative identification on Stephen Rendon.
19-year-old Stephen Rendon had been reported missing by his mother 3 days earlier. When the medical examiner confirms Stephen's identity, police notify his mother.
2 gentlemen from the Bexar County Sheriff came in, you know, and they introduced themselves to me and stuff. And I had thought maybe they were going to be there to kind of talk to me, you know, ask me more questions or anything like that. And he kind of just said they had found a body out in the field, and everything kind of just went blank. Waiting for my son for 5 days, not knowing where he was at. Any parent shouldn't be feeling that, you know, going to bed without not knowing where their child is at, not eating, you know, and it just, a parent should not be going through that at all.
Detectives learned that Stephen had recently graduated high school and was living at home in order to save money for a place of his own.
He was a very easygoing person, very loving, you know, he had a very big heart. I would always tell Stephen, and Stephen knew that. I said, I don't know what I did in my life to deserve someone like you. I said, God gave me a beautiful gift.
Kathy tells police she last saw her son on the night of June 25th, when he told her he was going to hang out at a friend's house.
She didn't have a whole lot to offer as in where he went. She didn't have a lot of details when he left that night, where he was going, who he was meeting up with. So she didn't have those things to offer to detectives.
But when investigators ask Kathy for a description of Stephen's car, they're surprised by her response.
He was driving an orange Mitsubishi Lancer.
It's the same make and model of car that their first victim, Xavier Cordero, drove.
Both of them drove a Mitsubishi Lancer, which was unique also as far as being compared to a double murder connected with a certain type of vehicle.
Growing more concerned they're dealing with a possible serial killer, the Bexar County Sheriff's Office notifies all nearby law enforcement agencies. They also put out a bolo for Stephen Rendon's missing car. No sooner does the vehicle's description go out than police receive a strange tip about another recent crime.
The day before Stephen Rendon was found, there was an aggravated robbery case that happened within the city limits.
And it was while investigating the robbery that San Antonio police uncovered stunning new evidence connecting the crime to the unsolved killing spree.
San Antonio Police Department called us up and told us that they discovered information in the murder of Xavier Cordero and Stephen Rendon.
Coming up, a witness comes forward with a harrowing story.
A store clerk was shot in the face.
And police revisit a person of interest.
What do you know about what happened to Xavier?
He never showed up to our clinic.
Police in Bexar County, Texas are searching for a possible serial killer in connection to the identical murders of Xavier Cordero and Stephen Rendon. When they receive word that a suspect who'd been recently arrested for a robbery in San Antonio may be linked to the crimes.
The day before Stephen Rendon's body was found, there was an aggravated robbery where there was a store clerk that was shot in the face.
The clerk survived, and detectives learned that a witness at the store had followed the assailant across the street and directed police to his location at an apartment complex.
Police SWAT showed up and eventually set up an area around the apartment.
After an hour-long standoff, the perpetrator finally gave up and was apprehended. He was identified as 20-year-old Cameo Clines. Once Cameo was in police custody, officers searched his apartment and found his girlfriend, 19-year-old Antoinette Martinez. The same Antoinette who Bexar County detectives had already questioned in connection to the murder of Xavier Cordero.
Law enforcement ultimately conducted a search of that apartment.
They found driver's license in the toilet bowl tank. One was Xavier Cordero and the other one was Stephen Randall.
And there was an orange Mitsubishi Lancer parked right in front of the apartment complex.
Stephen's car was right there.
When detectives with the Bexar County Sheriff's Office received word of the discoveries, they joined the San Antonio police in processing Antoinette's apartment.
We also found some brown packaging tape. I knew immediately that that was a close resemblance of the packaging tape that I saw at the crime scene.
Police also recover the .25 caliber handgun that Cameo Clines had used in the convenience store robbery. And a forensic sweep uncovers even more evidence inside the apartment.
Sure enough, we started getting results for possible blood. Our evidence tech ended up cutting those portions of the rug, and those did get sent out to the medical examiners.
Authorities immediately booked Cameo Clines and Antoinette Martinez on suspicion of murder. Cameo is taken to the Bexar County Jail, where he is also arraigned on robbery charges, while Antoinette is transferred to the sheriff's office for questioning.
She denied everything. She said, no, I don't have anything to do with it.
What do you know about what happened to Xavier?
He never showed up to my apartment.
But Antoinette's story begins to crumble when she's faced with the mounting physical evidence connecting her to both victims.
At a point through the conversation, she started confessing that she was involved in the homicides and Mr. Cline was involved also.
Pretty much robbed him.
Robbed him?
Yeah. Pretty much shot him.
You shot him?
Pretty much dead.
He's pretty much dead?
Pretty much.
Antoinette admits that the events that led to both murders and the convenience store robbery had all started at work, when she confided in Cameo that she wasn't receiving fair compensation.
She wasn't getting overtime. She was working 60 and 80 hours a week. And so that offended her.
9 days straight, I will open and close, open and close, open and close. No days off, no break. Like to the point where my feet were bleeding yesterday.
Cameo says, hey, we need to go in there. We need to get paid for all the hours that we're working.
Antoinette tells detectives that when their requests for raises were denied, she and Cameo came up with a quicker way to make money.
They started with stealing the money from work, but they escalated very quickly, obviously, because the next thing they do is they decide to rob somebody.
Cameo and Antoinette developed a plan to lure people over to their apartment and rob them at gunpoint.
Antoinette explains that she and Cameo had chosen her friend Xavier Cordero as their first robbery target because she knew he always had cash.
On June 18th of 2014, Antoinette reached out to Xavier Cordero. She lured him over to her apartment that night under the pretense of the two of them having sexual relations.
When Xavier arrived, Antoinette led him into the bedroom in order to seduce him.
At this point, he does not know that Cameo Clines is also in the apartment and he's hiding in the bathroom.
Told him that we were gonna have sex because he was sitting on the chairs. Cameo came out with a gun.
At some point, Cameo Clines kind of overwhelms Xavier, and that's when Xavier Cordero is hit. He is pistol whipped, and he falls down on the carpet.
He started bleeding, I guess, once he got hit in the nose.
They tied him up, they walked him to his vehicle, which was parked outside. It was a black Mitsubishi Lancer. They had him get in the trunk of that car, and they drove him up to a rural field.
Antoinette stayed in the car while Cameo dragged Xavier out of the trunk. She says the plan had only been to rob Xavier, so she expected Cameo to let him go after taking his wallet. But she was surprised by what she heard next.
He gets Xavier out of the vehicle, and she hears 2 gunshots.
I heard a gunshot, and then I think his dad, he was like, I don't know, I think he was still breathing, and he went back to go make sure. Shot him again.
The wallet itself, did you get any money from the wallet? The wallet said he had money, so how much money did he have?
I know it's more than 125 and less than 250. It was all the rent money.
Rent money?
That's what I thought it was. That's why I didn't believe to do it.
She was the beneficiary of these capital murders. She was the one that was keeping the money because she needed the money for rent.
Antoinette tells detectives that she and Cameo drove Xavier's car around for the next 24 hours until they heard his body had been discovered.
June 25th, the same type of event took place. This time it involved a stranger, and that stranger was Stephen Rendon.
The information we got was that he was on an app called Meet Me. Antoinette and Martinez contacted Stephen Rendon through that Meet Me app. We were looking at the profile pics that Rendon posted, and that Lancer was on his photo. And so probably, she's scrolling through the people and noticed, boom, there's a guy with the same vehicle. Let's go after him.
The victim.
Huh?
They found the victim.
So, Cameo? So Cameo found the victim?
Yeah.
The fact that she referred to him as a victim was very unsettling, was very chilling, because it showed her underlying intent, that their plan was not just to rob these 2 young men, but to rob and to kill them.
You said that your intention was to do this fake profile to do what?
Get another victim. I needed a car. I needed money.
Her whole plan was to rob him. Of course, Stephen Rendon doesn't know that. He's coming over for a possible sexual encounter with Antoinette Martinez. She tells me that as soon as he walks into the door, she tells him that, hey, this is a kind of a kinky thing. Let me tie you up with this tape. He agrees with it, he goes along with it, and Antoinette Martinez then goes and uses that brown packaging tape and tapes his arms, his hands, and his legs. That's when Cameo comes out of the closet, and then he starts holding the gun to Stephen Rendon's head. This is around either 9 or 10 at night. They were able to walk Stephen Rendon down the stairs and actually get him into the car and drive him out into the area where he was shot and killed. Stephen Rendon never put up a fight. He cooperated all the way up until his death. As soon as Stephen Rendon walks into the field, that's when Cameo Clines pulled the trigger.
Antoinette tells detectives that the money they stole from Stephen Rendon was far less than what they had made off of Xavier Cordero.
I got only $5 in his pocket.
She brings it up to the detective in her interview that it really annoyed her that he didn't have more cash. At some point when they still needed money because they weren't able to get a very big score off of Stephen Rendon, Cameo decides that he's gonna rob the convenience store across the street. And but for the robbery of that convenience store, they may have never been able to solve the two murders. Antoinette never shows any emotion, even when talking about what happened. She said, we were like Bonnie and Clyde. I think she saw Bonnie and Clyde as kind of like heroes in a way. These were two outlaw gangsters, and she wanted to be that as well.
Coming up, police sit down with Cameo Clines and get a much different story.
He's denying everything.
And new evidence leaves police guessing as to who the true mastermind was behind the deadly crime spree.
He did state that he's not a killer, that he didn't want to kill anybody.
In San Antonio, Texas, 19-year-old Antoinette Martinez and 20-year-old Cameo Clines have been connected to the brutal murders of Xavier Cordero and Stephen Rendon. Antoinette has confessed to participating in the homicides, but she claims Cameo is the one who pulled the trigger.
Mr. Cline was still in custody for that aggravated robbery. So that's when we start bringing him down, and he's denying everything.
We talked to Antoinette Martinez, and she agreed to try to convince Cameo Clines to confess.
We chose to put them together in the interview room, with close observation. And the first thing that I remember is they start smiling and laughing. They're just like not a worry in the world at the time.
I'm going down for armed robbery. You're going down for 2 days. I'll write you in 15 years, dude.
They were still talking like they were still lovers. So we stopped that interview. I escorted Antoinette Martinez out. As I'm coming back into the room thinking that I was gonna interview Cameo again about, what was going on, I noticed that he was crying on the floor.
He's like, well, I'll go ahead and, I'll go ahead and talk to you. I'll confess. He did state at the beginning, that he's not a killer, that he didn't want to kill anybody. His thing was that he just wanted to rob these individuals.
Cameo claims that killing both men had always been Antoinette's idea.
For what reason did y'all do this to Xavier?
I mean, he persuaded.
So she persuaded you to do this?
Yes, sir. She didn't like how he treated her. Tell me why, Stephen. They're trying to make money. Okay. He's the victim.
It really stuck with me that these were little more than kids. And how did we get here? How did we get here where these two could come together and basically create this perfect killer couple? Because they really were. Without each other, I don't think that we would have either one of the murders.
Bexar County authorities charge Cameo Clines and Antoinette Martinez with 2 counts of capital murder.
I was scrolling on Facebook and I see her friend share an article, and I click on the article and I read it and I see Antoinette's mugshot. And at that point I just get chills all over my body because I could never imagine Antoinette doing what the article was describing.
Following their arrests, authorities continue to build their case against the couple.
Later on, when the detectives kind of put everything together and ballistics testing was done, it was determined that that same .25 caliber firearm used in the robbery was also used to kill both Xavier Cordero and Stephen Rendon. It was certainly shocking and reckless on their part in that Cameo robbed a convenience store that they shopped at, and in fact, law enforcement obtained surveillance footage from that gas station, and that surveillance footage showed Cameo and Antoinette purchasing that tape that was found at both crime scenes where the bodies were recovered.
With a mountain of evidence against the couple, attorneys for Cameo Clines approached the prosecution about a plea bargain. And on January 12, 2016, Cameo pleads guilty to 2 counts of murder.
Mr. Clines pled to 2 concurrent life sentences for murder, and then stacked on top of that was the 20 years for the aggravated assault against the storekeeper.
Antoinette Martinez decides to try her luck in front of a jury. Her capital murder trial begins in a Bexar County courtroom on September 12, 2017.
They went from being friends to, in her own words, Bonnie and Clyde.
Despite her confession to police, Antoinette pleads not guilty to all charges.
The defense argued that Antoinette was under the spell, the influence of Cameo Clines, and that but for Cameo Clines, Antoinette would never have committed these 2 murders. Unfortunately, though, even if someone is in a toxic relationship, they are still ultimately responsible for their actions.
In the end, the jury sides with the prosecution.
Antoinette was found guilty of capital murder. She received an automatic sentence of life without parole. In other words, Antoinette Martinez will spend the remainder of her life in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. What I'm grateful for is that the jury did the right thing, and that the jury was able to give Xavier Cordero and Stephen Rendon the justice that they deserve, and the justice that their families deserve, because they're victims in this too.
Just do the best as you can in protecting your child. Know what they're doing. You don't want to tell me where you're going. Tell somebody else where you're going. So that way we know where to find you in case if anything is to happen. You know, because I don't want another parent to be going through what I went through. It's been 5 years. Hasn't gotten any better. Years go by, it gets worse, because that means the longer you are without them.
Manchester in the winter of 1974 was a city that seemed permanently wrapped in darkness. Long after sunset, the factory district still breathed smoke into the cold air, and narrow streets glistened beneath weak yellow street lamps that barely cut through the fog. In the north of the city, rows of brick terraced houses stood shoulder to shoulder like tired witnesses to decades of industrial decline. Rainwater gathered in cracked pavements. Canals moved slowly through forgotten parts of town. At night, footsteps echoed louder than they should have, especially for young women walking home alone after work, after parties, or after visiting friends. It was a city where people worked late, where buses stopped running too early, and where many ordinary routines required crossing dark streets in silence. And somewhere in that silence, a predator was already moving, long before the newspapers gave him a name, before detectives realized they were hunting the same man, before families understood that their missing daughters would never return home. Trevor Hardy was already there, wandering the streets of Manchester after midnight. To some people in his neighborhood, he was simply another violent man from a rough area. To others, he was unpredictable, dangerous, the kind of person who made strangers cross the street to avoid him. But no one yet understood what he would become. Years later, the press would call him the Beast of Manchester, a nickname that sounded almost theatrical, almost fictional, as though it belonged to a horror story instead of real life. But there was nothing fictional about the fear that spread through Manchester between 1974 and 1976. There was nothing fictional about the girls who vanished into the night and never came home again. And there was certainly nothing fictional about the mistakes that allowed a killer to continue, walking free even after police had already begun circling around him. This story is not about criminal genius. Trevor Hardy was not sophisticated. He did not possess the calculated charm often associated with infamous serial killers. He was impulsive, violent, unstable, and frighteningly reckless. Yet somehow, despite repeated warning signs, despite a long history of aggression, despite growing suspicion from people close to him, he slipped through the hands of investigators at the exact moment when stopping him might have saved lives. That possibility hangs over the entire case like a shadow. Because one of the most disturbing aspects of the Trevor Hardy investigation is not simply the brutality of the murders themselves, but the realization that there was a point where everything might have ended earlier. A point where police believed they had their man. A point where forensic evidence seemed to be moving toward a breakthrough. And then, somehow, he walked free again. By the time authorities finally arrested Hardy for good in 1976, 3 teenage girls were dead. 15-year-old Janet Leslie Stewart, 17-year-old Wanda Scala, and 17-year-old Sharon Mosoff. Each of them had ordinary lives, ordinary routines, families waiting for them at home. None of them could possibly have imagined that they would become connected forever through one of Manchester's most haunting murder cases. Even today, decades later, Trevor Hardy remains strangely less known than many British serial killers. His crimes never achieved the same international notoriety as others from the era. Perhaps because his murders occurred in working-class neighborhoods far from celebrity culture. Perhaps because the victims were ordinary teenage girls whose lives did not attract sensational headlines until it was already too late. Or perhaps because the case exposed uncomfortable truths about policing failures during the 1970s. Truths that many institutions preferred not to revisit too closely. Yet among true crime historians and former investigators, the Hardy case still provokes unease. Not only because of the violence, but because of the details surrounding it. The mutilation inflicted after death. The trophies allegedly kept from victims. The shocking revelation that Hardy had reportedly used a metal file to grind down his own teeth. While in custody in order to damage bite mark evidence investigators hoped would link him to one of the murders. It sounds almost unbelievable, almost desperate. But desperation can be dangerous when it comes from someone terrified of being caught. And in Hardy's case, that desperation may have worked. For months, perhaps longer, Manchester lived with uncertainty instead of answers. Families searched streets and waited beside telephones. Detectives tried to connect fragments that did not yet form a complete picture. Rumors spread through neighborhoods faster than confirmed information. Parents warned daughters not to walk home alone. Young women traveled in groups whenever possible. Every dark street became a source of anxiety. Every delayed arrival home triggered panic. Fear changes the atmosphere of a city in subtle ways. It changes how long people linger outside pubs after dark. It changes how mothers look out windows waiting for children to return. It changes the silence between neighbors when another body is discovered and nobody wants to say out loud what everyone is already thinking. Somewhere out there, a killer is still walking among us. But before Manchester knew fear, before the headlines and police dragnets and courtroom trials, there was simply Trevor Hardy himself. Born in Manchester in 1945, Hardy grew up surrounded by violence and became known for it early. People who encountered him later described a man with an explosive temper, someone capable of frightening aggression without warning. As a child, he reportedly showed cruelty toward both animals and people. As an adult, his life became a pattern of assaults, thefts, and street violence. Before the murders connected his name permanently to British criminal history, Hardy had already served time in prison for attacking a man with a pickaxe. Even then, there were warning signs everywhere. Yet warning signs are not always enough. In many violent offender cases, hindsight creates the illusion that disaster was inevitable. But at the time, dangerous men existed in many parts of Manchester. Most never became serial killers. Most never escalated into something far darker. Hardy did. And perhaps the most chilling part is how ordinary the beginning appeared. A missing girl on New Year's Eve. A teenager failing to return home after work. Another girl disappearing after a party. Individually, each incident seemed tragic but isolated. Together, they formed a pattern of predation hidden in plain sight. The first known victim, Janet Leslie Stewart, disappeared on December 31st, 1974. She was only 15 years old. New Year's Eve should have been filled with celebration, family gatherings, countdowns toward midnight. Instead, Janet vanished in the Newton Heath area of Manchester, and at first nobody knew what had happened to her. Families and police considered possibilities common in missing person cases involving teenagers. Had she run away? Was she staying with friends? Had she become lost or injured somewhere? Hope survives longest when certainty does not exist. And for months, Janet's family continued living inside that uncertainty, not realizing that she had already been murdered and buried in a shallow grave near school. According to Hardy's later confession, he attacked Janet after mistaking her for another girl he had become obsessed with. After killing her, he took her ring and later gave it to another girl as a gift. That single detail, keeping something personal from the victim and transforming it into a twisted souvenir, would become one of the many elements investigators later viewed as deeply disturbing. But at the time of Janet's disappearance, nobody connected the event to a serial predator. There was no larger pattern yet, no public warning, no understanding of what had begun. Then came Wanda Scala, 17 years old, working late at a hotel bar in Mostown. On the night of July 19th, 1975, Wanda finished her shift and began walking home alone. She never arrived. Hardy attacked her on Lightbone Road, beating her unconscious before sexually assaulting and murdering her. Her body was later discovered at a construction site in a condition so brutal that the murder shocked even experienced investigators. The injuries suggested overwhelming violence and deep rage. Detectives also identified bite marks on the victim's body, a crucial forensic clue during an era before DNA technology transformed criminal investigations. Manchester police responded with one of the largest investigations the city had seen. More than 23,000 people were stopped and questioned as authorities searched, desperately for answers. Fear spread rapidly through the city now because Wanda's murder felt undeniably different. More personal, more savage. Rumors of a killer began circulating openly. And for a moment, it appeared investigators might actually stop him. Hardy became a suspect after allegedly boasting about the crime to his own brother. Police arrested him. Investigators examined the bite mark evidence carefully. Suspicion intensified. But then the case began falling apart. Hardy's girlfriend provided him with an alibi. More importantly, while being held in custody, Hardy reportedly used a metal file to alter his own teeth. By the time forensic comparisons were made again, the bite marks no longer matched clearly enough to secure the evidence detectives needed. And so Trevor Hardy walked free. That decision would haunt the case forever. Because after his release, another girl died. Sharon Mosoff was 17 years old when she attended a staff party in March 1976. At some point after leaving alone, according to investigators, she may have encountered Hardy while he attempted to break into a shopping center. Police later believed Hardy killed her because she had seen him during the attempted burglary. He attacked Sharon with a knife, strangled her using tights, and dumped her body in the Rochdale Canal at Failsworth. Once again, investigators found similarities to the earlier murders. Another teenage victim, another nighttime attack, another body subjected to mutilation after death. By then, the truth could no longer be ignored. Manchester was dealing with a serial killer. What followed was a race against fear, against public pressure, and against the horrifying possibility that there might be more victims nobody had connected yet. when Hardy was finally arrested again in August 1976. Detectives found blood-stained clothing and Wanda Scala's handbag inside his home. Under interrogation, Hardy confessed not only to the murders of Wanda and Sharon, but also to Janet Stewart, whose disappearance had remained unsolved for nearly 2 years. Hardy personally led investigators to Janet's burial site. Whatever hope still existed for her family ended there, in the cold reality of recovered remains and confirmed truth. The trial that followed would convict Hardy on 3 counts of murder and sentence him to life imprisonment. Yet, even after the verdict, questions lingered. Some investigators suspected there may have been additional victims. Community suspicion surrounded the earlier death of Dorothy Lydon, though later DNA testing failed to conclusively connect Hardy to the case. And perhaps most haunting of all was the question that can never truly be answered. If investigators had managed to hold Hardy after Wanda Scala's murder, would Sharon Mossoff still be alive? Cases like Trevor Hardy's force uncomfortable reflection because they reveal how violence often grows gradually before society fully recognizes it. There are warning signs, prior assaults, escalating aggression, moments where intervention nearly succeeds. But nearly is meaningless to grieving families. For the people who love Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mossoff, the story does not end with a conviction or a prison sentence. It ends with empty spaces at dinner tables, birthdays permanently frozen in memory, and the unbearable knowledge that ordinary nights became the final nights of 3 young lives. Trevor Hardy died in prison in 2012 after serving more than 35 years behind bars. By then, he had become one of Britain's longest-serving prisoners. Some relatives of the victims publicly expressed relief upon hearing of his death. But relief is not closure. Closure is a word often used carelessly in true crime stories, as though justice can erase suffering once a killer is locked away. In reality, these cases linger for decades in the memories of families, detectives, witnesses, and entire communities. Manchester eventually moved on, as cities always do. Streets changed, buildings disappeared. New generations grew up unaware of the fear that once gripped those neighborhoods during the mid-1970s. But beneath the passage of time remains the story of 3 girls who should have had the chance to grow older, and of a violent man who kept finding opportunities to continue hurting people until the law finally stopped him. This is the story of Trevor Hardy, not the myth, not the tabloid nickname, but the reality behind it, the victims, the failures, the investigation, and the terrifying period when a killer moved through Manchester almost unnoticed until it was already too late. Before the murders were connected, before newspapers began using phrases like the Beast of Manchester, the city itself already carried a quiet exhaustion that shaped everyday life for the people living there. Manchester during the 1970s was not the glamorous image often associated with modern Britain. It was a city built on factories, warehouses, railway lines, an industrial labor that had once powered enormous economic growth, but was now beginning to show signs of decline. Entire neighborhoods in the northern districts seemed permanently coated in soot and dampness. Rows of brick homes crowded narrow streets where children still played football near abandoned lots, and where people often knew the routines of every family living within walking distance. There was a familiarity to those communities, but also hardship. Factories closed. Employment became unstable. Public infrastructure aged badly. In some districts, broken streetlights remained unfixed for weeks, leaving stretches of road almost completely dark after sunset. And yet life continued in ordinary ways. Teenagers still attended parties. Young women still worked evening shifts at bars, hotels, and restaurants. People still walked home late because many families could not afford taxis and public transportation was limited at night. There was a sense of resilience in those neighborhoods, a belief that danger was something distant, something that happened elsewhere. But by the mid-1970s, a growing number of families in Manchester were beginning to realize that something had changed. Parents became more cautious about daughters returning home alone. Women started glancing over their shoulders while crossing empty streets at night. Rumors traveled faster than facts, and even before police publicly connected multiple crimes, there was an uneasy feeling spreading through certain parts of the city. Missing girls, violent attacks, strange men wandering after midnight. Nobody yet understood the full pattern, but fear rarely waits for official confirmation. It grows quietly, fed by whispers between neighbors and by stories repeated across kitchen tables after dark. And somewhere inside that atmosphere lived Trevor Joseph Hardy. Hardy was born in Manchester in 1945, long before his name would become attached to one of the city's most disturbing murder investigations. The details available about his early life are limited, but what later emerged painted a portrait of a deeply violent individual whose aggression had been visible for years before the killings began. From childhood onward, Hardy reportedly displayed cruelty toward both people and animals. Those who knew him described a volatile personality, someone prone to sudden rage and unpredictable behavior. Violence was not an occasional outburst in his life. It appeared to be woven into his identity from an early age. As he grew older, that aggression escalated into criminal behavior. Hardy became involved in theft, assaults, and street violence throughout adulthood. He was not considered an intelligent criminal mastermind, nor someone capable of maintaining a respectable public image while secretly hiding monstrous acts. In fact, the opposite was true. He already had a reputation for being dangerous. People in his area reportedly viewed him as unstable and frightening. He wandered streets late at night. He intimidated others. His own brother would later claim that Hardy boasted about acts of cruelty and violence, as though he enjoyed shocking people with stories of his behavior. One of the most serious known incidents before the murders involved Hardy attacking a man with a pickaxe, an assault severe enough to send him to prison. Even before the killings of teenage girls began, Hardy had already demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence. Looking back, that history creates an uncomfortable question. How does someone with such a long record of aggression continue slipping through systems designed to identify dangerous offenders? But hindsight often sharpens patterns that were less obvious in real time. Violent men were not uncommon in parts of Manchester during that era. Assaults, drunken fights, and criminal activity existed across many struggling neighborhoods. Most offenders did not become serial killers. The terrifying reality in Hardy's case is that the warning signs existed, but nobody yet realized how far his violence would escalate. While Hardy moved through Manchester with a growing reputation for aggression, the young women who would eventually become his victims were living ordinary teenage lives. Their stories matter because true crime history too often reduces victims to names attached to a killer's narrative. But Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosoff were not background characters in Trevor Hardy's story. They were individuals with families, routines, friendships, plans, and futures that ended violently long before they should have. The first known victim was Janet Leslie Stewart. Janet was only 15 years old when she disappeared on New Year's Eve in 1974. 15 is an age suspended awkwardly between childhood and adulthood. Old enough to seek independence, but still young enough for parents to expect a daughter home safely before midnight. New Year's Eve in Manchester carried its own atmosphere during the 1970s. Streets were busy with people attending celebrations, pubs remained crowded, and families prepared to welcome a new year together. Somewhere inside that ordinary celebration, Janet vanished. The exact details of her final movements remain limited within the known facts of the case. But investigators later established that she disappeared in the Newton Heath area of northern Manchester on December 31st, 1974. At first, confusion dominated the response. Missing teenager cases are emotionally complex because families often cling desperately to the possibility that a child may still be alive somewhere. Parents wait for phone calls. Friends retrace conversations, searching for clues. Police weigh countless possibilities: running away, accidents, voluntary absence, misunderstandings. In Janet's case, there was no immediate indication that she had encountered a serial predator. Her family lived in uncertainty rather than confirmed grief. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Hope remained alive precisely because nobody yet understood the truth. Later, after his arrest, Trevor Hardy confessed to killing Janet. According to that confession, he claimed he had mistaken her for another girl he had become obsessed with. The attack itself was brutal. Hardy stabbed Janet repeatedly before burying her body in a shallow grave near school. But perhaps one of the most chilling details emerged afterward. Hardy took Janet's ring and later gave it to another girl as a gift. Investigators would later interpret this as trophy-taking behavior, something seen in certain violent offenders who keep objects connected to victims as a way of preserving emotional control over the crime. Yet at the time Janet disappeared, nobody knew she had already been murdered. Her body remained hidden. Her family continued waiting. There's a unique cruelty in cases involving undiscovered victims because loved ones remain trapped between hope and dread. A confirmed death is devastating, but uncertainty creates a different kind of torment. Every phone call becomes significant. Every possible sighting renews emotional exhaustion. For Janet's family, the truth remained buried alongside her body while the man responsible continued walking free through Manchester streets. Months later, another young woman encountered Trevor Hardy under terrifyingly violent circumstances. Wanda Scala was 17 years old, slightly older than Janet, but still a teenager navigating ordinary responsibilities. She worked at a hotel bar in Moe's Ton, a northern district of Manchester. Working late shifts was common for young people trying to earn money, especially in working-class communities where teenagers often entered employment early. On the evening of July 19, 1975, Wanda finished work and began walking home alone. It was a routine countless young women followed every day without incident. But routines become dangerous when predators learn how predictable they are. Somewhere along Lightbone Road, Hardy attacked her. According to later findings, he used a brick or stone to strike Wanda in the head with enough force to incapacitate her. He then robbed, sexually assaulted, and murdered her. The violence inflicted on Wanda shocked investigators when her body was eventually discovered at a construction site. She was found partially undressed, and the injuries suggested not only murder but intense post-mortem mutilation. One of the most disturbing forensic discoveries involved bite marks left on her body. During the 1970s, bite mark analysis was considered a potentially important forensic tool, particularly in cases involving sexual violence. Detectives understood immediately that the evidence might become crucial in identifying the killer. Wanda's murder transformed fear into panic throughout Manchester. Unlike Janet's disappearance, this was undeniably a homicide and an extraordinarily brutal one. Public anxiety intensified rapidly. Newspapers covered the investigation extensively. Women became more cautious traveling at night. Parents warned daughters repeatedly about walking alone. Police launched a massive investigation involving more than 23,000 interviews and street stops in an attempt to identify suspects. Detectives worked under enormous pressure as public fear grew. The scale of the operation reflected how seriously authorities viewed the threat. But despite the intensity of the investigation, Hardy initially remained free. The reason that Wanda's case remains especially haunting is because investigators actually came dangerously close to stopping him after her murder. Hardy reportedly attracted police attention after boasting about the crime to his own brother. This detail matters because it reveals something deeply unsettling about Hardy's psychology. Some violent offenders attempt to disappear completely after crimes. Others seek emotional satisfaction from revealing fragments of truth, testing boundaries, or demonstrating superiority over those around them. According to later accounts, Hardy's own behavior contributed to suspicion falling upon him. Police arrested him. For a brief moment, it appeared the investigation might end there. But the case against Hardy began unraveling before authorities could secure enough evidence. His girlfriend provided an alibi that weakened prosecutors' confidence. At the same time, investigators focused heavily on the bite marks found on Wanda's body. Those marks potentially linked the killer directly to the attack. Then came one of the most infamous details in the entire case. While in custody, Hardy reportedly used a metal file to grind down or alter his own teeth in an effort to destroy the forensic comparison investigators were preparing. Whether motivated by panic, cunning, or desperation, the act proved devastatingly effective. When the dental evidence no longer matched clearly enough, the prosecution lacked the certainty required to move forward. Hardy was released. It is difficult to overstate how catastrophic that moment appears in retrospect. Police had identified a dangerous suspect connected to one of Manchester's most brutal murders. Yet because of limited forensic technology, conflicting evidence, and the altered bite marks, they could not hold him. The consequence of that failure would soon become horrifyingly clear. In March 1976, another 17-year-old girl named Sharon Mosoff attended a staff party before beginning her journey home alone. According to investigators, Sharon may have encountered Hardy while he was attempting to break into a shopping center during the night. Police later believe that Hardy killed her to eliminate a witness who had seen him during the attempted burglary. Once again, ordinary circumstances collided fatally with predatory violence. Sharon was attacked with a knife and later strangled using tights. Afterward, Hardy dumped her body into the Rochdale Canal at Failsworth. Investigators also identified similarities between Sharon's death and the earlier attacks. Another teenage victim, another nighttime encounter, another body subjected to mutilation after death. By this stage, detectives could no longer ignore the growing pattern. Manchester was facing not isolated acts of violence, but a serial offender targeting young women across northern districts of the city. The realization transformed the investigation. Public fear intensified further because serial murder introduces a terrifying unpredictability into ordinary life. People begin imagining danger everywhere. Any unknown man walking behind a woman at night becomes suspicious. Every unsolved assault seems potentially connected. Communities become trapped in anticipation of the next attack. Yet amidst that fear, the victims themselves risk becoming overshadowed by the mythology surrounding the killer. That is why their stories matter so deeply. Janet Stewart was not simply victim one. She was a 15-year-old girl whose family spent months believing she might still come home. Wanda Scala was not merely a crime scene in a police report. She was a teenager working an ordinary shift before her life ended in horrifying violence. Sharon Mosoff was not just the final confirmed victim in a murder series. She was another young woman whose future disappeared during a single night in Manchester. The atmosphere surrounding these cases cannot be understood fully without recognizing how vulnerable young women often were during that era. Late-night employment, isolated streets, limited transportation, and minimal public surveillance created conditions where predators could operate with frightening freedom. Women were often expected simply to be careful, as though caution alone could protect someone encountering extreme violence. And throughout all of this, Trevor Hardy continued moving through the same communities where people were already beginning to fear him. The contrast is haunting. Families locked doors earlier. Girls avoided walking alone. Detectives searched desperately for answers. Meanwhile, the man responsible remained physically close to the very neighborhoods terrified by his crimes. In many serial murder cases, the killer appears outwardly normal or socially invisible. Hardy was different. He already carried a reputation for aggression and instability. Yet despite those warning signs, despite previous imprisonment for violent assault, despite growing suspicion after Wanda Scala's murder, the system failed to stop him before another girl died. That failure would become one of the defining shadows hanging over the Trevor Hardy case for decades. Afterward, the murders connected to Trevor Hardy did not unfold in a single burst of violence that immediately revealed the presence of a serial killer. Instead, they emerged gradually, hidden inside separate incidents that at first appeared disconnected by circumstance and time. This slow emergence is part of what made the case so terrifying. By the time investigators fully understood they were dealing with a repeat offender targeting teenage girls, 3 young lives had already been destroyed. Looking back now, the similarities between the crimes seem painfully obvious. The victims were all teenage girls. They were attacked while alone at night in northern areas of Manchester. The violence was excessive, deeply personal, and followed by post-mortem mutilation. Hardy appeared to take souvenirs from at least one victim, suggesting a psychological attachment to the crimes that extended beyond the murders themselves. But patterns are easier to recognize in hindsight. During the early stages of the investigation, detectives were dealing not with a completed picture, but with fragments scattered across months of uncertainty and fear. The first fragment was Janet Leslie Stewart. When Janet disappeared on New Year's Eve in 1974, investigators did not immediately treat the case as murder. That decision was not unusual for the era. During the 1970s, missing teenager cases often began with assumptions that the child may have run away voluntarily, stayed with friends, or become temporarily unreachable. Police resources were limited, and authorities had to weigh numerous possibilities before escalating a case into a full-scale homicide investigation. But for Janet's family, those procedural realities offered little comfort. Every passing hour intensified fear. New Year's Eve should have ended with celebration, with families counting down toward midnight and welcoming the beginning of another year together. Instead, Janet's loved ones entered the new year with growing panic and unanswered questions. The emotional burden of a missing person case differs profoundly from confirmed death. Grief becomes suspended. Families search for clues in ordinary details. Was there something unusual in her behavior beforehand? Did she mention meeting anyone? Did someone see her after she disappeared? Hope survives because certainty does not yet exist. In Janet's case, that hope lasted for months. Unknown to her family, Trevor Hardy had already murdered her shortly after encountering her in Newton Heath. According to his later confession, Hardy claimed he mistook Janet for another girl he had become fixated on. Whether that explanation was truthful or was simply an attempt to rationalize his actions remains impossible to know. What is certain is that the attack was savage. Hardy stabbed Janet repeatedly before burying her body in a shallow grave near school. Then he returned to ordinary life while her family continued searching for her. One of the most disturbing elements surrounding Janet's murder was Hardy's behavior afterward. He allegedly removed Janet's ring and later gave it to another girl as a present. Trophy-taking behavior has long disturbed investigators in violent crime cases because it suggests the offender wants to preserve a connection to the act itself. The object becomes more than stolen property. It becomes a private reminder of domination, secrecy, and control. Yet during the months following Janet's disappearance, no one understood that a killer had already claimed his first confirmed victim. Manchester continued functioning normally. Streets remained busy. Teenagers continued walking home alone, and Trevor Hardy remained free. By the summer of 1975, Hardy's violence escalated further with the murder of Wanda Scala. Unlike Janet's disappearance, Wanda's case immediately revealed the brutality investigators were facing. Wanda was 17 years old and working at a hotel bar in Mostown. On July 19, 1975, she completed her shift and began walking home alone late at night. It was a routine she had likely followed before without incident. There is something especially tragic about crimes rooted in ordinary routine because they reveal how quickly normal life can become irreversible. Wanda was not engaging in dangerous behavior. She was simply trying to return home after work. Somewhere along Lightbone Road, Hardy attacked her. According to later findings, he struck her with a brick or heavy object, likely rendering her unconscious or severely incapacitated almost immediately. The attack that followed involved robbery, sexual assault, and murder. Hardy's violence toward Wanda displayed a level of brutality far beyond impulsive assault. Her body was later discovered at a construction site in a partially undressed state, bearing evidence of severe mutilation. Even experienced detectives found the crime scene deeply disturbing. Among the most significant forensic discoveries were bite marks left on Wanda's body. Today, forensic science relies heavily on DNA analysis, surveillance footage, and digital evidence. But during the mid-1970s, investigators often depended on physical impressions, witness testimony, and comparative analysis techniques that now appear limited by modern standards. Bite mark evidence was considered potentially powerful because human dentition is unique in many respects. Detectives believed those marks could directly identify the attacker if a suspect were located. Wanda's murder transformed public anxiety into widespread fear. The discovery of her body sent shockwaves through Manchester communities already uneasy about violence against young women. Newspapers covered the case extensively, emphasizing both the savagery of the attack and the growing concern that a dangerous predator was moving through the city at night. Parents became increasingly protective. Women altered routines whenever possible. Some avoided walking alone after dark entirely. Others carried overwhelming fear silently because daily responsibilities left them little choice. In working-class neighborhoods where many families depended on shift work and public transport, avoiding nighttime travel was often unrealistic. Police responded aggressively to the murder investigation. More than 23,000 people were stopped and questioned during the search for Wanda's killer. The scale of the operation reflected not only the seriousness of the crime, but also the pressure investigators faced from an increasingly frightened public. Detectives examined countless leads, interviewed witnesses, and searched for any clue capable of narrowing the suspect pool. And then, astonishingly, the investigation began moving toward Trevor Hardy. Hardy reportedly attracted suspicion after boasting about the crime to his own brother. That detail remains chilling because it reveals a reckless arrogance developing alongside his violence. Some serial offenders experience growing confidence after successful attacks, particularly when they believe they have escaped detection. Hardy's alleged bragging suggests he may already have felt untouchable. Once police focused on him, investigators quickly recognized that Hardy fit the profile of a dangerous offender. He had a history of violence. He was known locally as unstable and aggressive. He already possessed a criminal record involving severe assault. For detectives, Hardy represented a plausible suspect in a murder defined by extreme brutality. Authorities arrested him and began building their case. At that point, the investigation seemed dangerously close to success. The bite mark evidence from Wanda's body appeared especially promising. If investigators could compare Hardy's teeth to the injuries found on the victim, they might secure the direct forensic link needed to prosecute him. But the case soon encountered devastating obstacles. Hardy's girlfriend provided an alibi that complicated the timeline investigators were attempting to establish. More critically, while in custody, Hardy reportedly gained access to a metal file and used it to alter his own teeth. The act itself sounds horrifyingly primitive. A man sitting in detention, grinding down his teeth in desperation to erase evidence connecting him to murder. Yet according to later reports, that tactic proved effective enough to damage the strength of the bite mark comparison. In the absence of conclusive forensic certainty and facing conflicting evidence, police lacked sufficient grounds to continue holding him. Trevor Hardy was released. That moment became one of the defining failures in the entire case. Investigators had identified a violent suspect connected to an exceptionally brutal murder. Yet limitations in evidence prevented them from securing charges. The consequences of releasing Hardy would soon become catastrophic. For the public, however, none of these internal investigative struggles were fully visible. Most people simply understood that a killer remained free. Fear intensified throughout Manchester as rumors spread about the brutality of Wanda's murder and the inability of police to identify the attacker. Every new assault or disappearance involving a young woman generated renewed panic. Parents warned daughters repeatedly about accepting rides, walking isolated routes, or traveling alone at night. Yet despite the fear, life still demanded movement through the city. Teenagers still attended parties. Workers still finished late shifts. And predators rely precisely on those ordinary routines continuing. In March 1976, another 17-year-old girl named Sharon Mosoff became the third confirmed victim connected to Hardy. Sharon attended a staff party before beginning her journey home alone. Investigators later theorized that her encounter with Hardy may have occurred accidentally while he was attempting to break into a shopping center during the night. According to that theory, Sharon saw him during the attempted burglary, making her a witness capable of identifying him. If true, the motive behind her murder was not sexual targeting alone, but elimination of a perceived threat. That possibility reveals another terrifying dimension to Hardy's violence. By this stage, killing may already have become an available solution whenever he felt cornered or exposed. The attack on Sharon was savage. Hardy assaulted her with a knife before strangling her using tights. Afterward, he disposed of her body in the Rochdale Canal at Failsworth. As investigators examined the crime, disturbing similarities emerged between Sharon's murder and the earlier attacks. Another teenage victim, another nighttime encounter, another body mutilated after death, another overwhelming display of violence. By now, detectives could no longer dismiss the possibility of a serial offender operating within Manchester. The pattern had become too consistent. The escalation also revealed something deeply unsettling about Hardy's behavior. Each crime appeared to reflect growing confidence and boldness. Janet's murder involved concealment through burial and remained undiscovered for a long period. Wanda's murder escalated in brutality and public visibility, producing widespread panic and a massive police operation. Sharon's killing occurred even after Hardy had already been arrested and released once. That sequence creates one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of the case. Hardy had come under direct police scrutiny and still continued killing afterward. For investigators, Sharon's murder intensified pressure enormously. The idea that a suspect previously detained in connection with Wanda's murder might still be active was horrifying. Detectives revisited earlier evidence, re-examined timelines, and increasingly focused attention back toward Hardy. At the same time, public confidence in police became strained. Communities wanted reassurance that the killer would be stopped before another girl died. Women altered their routines whenever possible. Parents escorted daughters to bus stops. Fear became embedded in ordinary movement throughout the city. Yet the murders also revealed broader realities about vulnerability during the era. The victims were not targeted because they behaved recklessly. They were targeted because they existed within environments where young women frequently had no choice but to travel alone at night. Industrial working schedules, poor transportation, isolated streets, and limited surveillance created opportunities predators could exploit repeatedly. Cases like Hardy's expose how violence often intersects with social conditions already placing people at risk. The murders themselves unfolded over nearly 2 years, but the emotional impact compressed time for those living through it. Families measured life according to disappearances, police searches, newspaper headlines, and funerals. Detectives lived inside cycles of frustration and urgency, knowing each investigative setback might allow further violence. Meanwhile, Trevor Hardy continued navigating the same streets where fear of him was already spreading, though few people yet knew his name. The terrifying reality of serial violence is not only the murders themselves, but the hidden period before society fully recognizes what is happening. During that hidden period, victims are often treated initially as isolated tragedies rather than pieces of a larger pattern. By the time the pattern becomes undeniable, irreversible damage has already occurred. In the Trevor Hardy case, the incidents unfolded gradually enough that understanding arrived too late for Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosoff. And hanging over every stage of the timeline was the same haunting question investigators and families would continue revisiting for decades afterward. If Hardy had not been released after Wanda's murder, could Sharon Mosoff still have survived? By the spring of 1976, the investigation surrounding the murders in Manchester had evolved from isolated police inquiries into a citywide hunt for a predator whose identity still remained frustratingly out of reach. Detectives now faced an increasingly terrifying possibility. The same man might be responsible for multiple attacks on teenage girls across northern Manchester. But understanding that possibility and proving it were two entirely different things. Modern audiences often view criminal investigations through the lens of DNA databases, digital surveillance, mobile phone tracking, and forensic technology capable of reconstructing movements with astonishing precision. None of that existed for investigators during the mid-1970s. Detectives relied heavily on witness statements, physical evidence recovered from crime scenes, behavioral observations, and comparative forensic methods that today would be considered limited or deeply controversial. Every inconsistency mattered. Every failed lead consumed valuable time. And in the Trevor Hardy case, time carried horrifying consequences. The murder of Wanda Scala had already generated enormous pressure on Manchester police. The brutality of the crime, combined with the fear spreading throughout local communities, transformed the investigation into a public obsession. Newspapers followed developments closely. Rumors circulated constantly. Some residents became convinced a serial killer was stalking the city long before authorities officially acknowledged such a possibility. Parents escorted daughters home after dark. Women traveled in groups whenever possible. Even ordinary nighttime silence began to feel threatening. Detectives understood that public confidence depended on results. Yet internally, they were struggling against the limitations of the era's investigative tools. The bite marks found on Wanda's body represented one of the most important forensic leads available. During the 1970s, bite mark analysis was viewed by many investigators as a potentially powerful form of identification. If the marks could be matched convincingly to a suspect's teeth, prosecutors might establish direct physical evidence linking the offender to the victim. That possibility made Trevor Hardy especially significant once suspicion began falling upon him. Hardy was already known to police as a violent offender. He had a criminal record involving assaults and aggressive behavior. He reportedly frightened people in his own neighborhood. And according to later accounts, suspicion intensified after Hardy boasted about Wanda's murder to his brother. That detail remains psychologically revealing because it suggested a dangerous mixture of arrogance and recklessness. Some offenders become emboldened after escaping punishment repeatedly. Each successful evasion reinforces the belief that they are untouchable. When police first detained Hardy after Wanda's murder, investigators likely felt they were closing in on a credible suspect capable of matching both the violence of the crime and the behavioral profile emerging from the case. Yet the investigation soon encountered devastating complications. Hardy's girlfriend reportedly provided an alibi that weakened the certainty detectives needed. In homicide investigations, alibis often become critical points of pressure because they can destabilize timelines and create reasonable doubt, even when suspicion remains strong. Detectives may personally believe a suspect is guilty while still recognizing they lack enough evidence to secure conviction. That tension appeared to define the Hardy investigation during this period. At the same time, investigators prepared forensic comparisons involving the bite marks found on Wanda's body. Then came one of the most shocking developments in the case. While being held in custody, Hardy allegedly gained access to a metal file and used it to alter his own teeth. The act itself was horrifyingly deliberate. According to later reports, Hardy understood that investigators were examining bite evidence, and he attempted to destroy the reliability of that comparison by physically grinding down parts of his teeth. Whether he fully understood forensic science or simply acted out of instinctive panic remains unclear, but the result was catastrophic for the investigation. Once the dental structure changed, the bite mark evidence lost much of its potential certainty. Combined with the conflicting alibi and lack of stronger direct evidence, detectives no longer possessed enough to hold him. Trevor Hardy walked free. In hindsight, this moment became the emotional breaking point of the entire case. Investigators had a violent suspect in custody, a suspect already linked through circumstance and suspicion to one of Manchester's most brutal murders. Yet because forensic science remained imperfect and the evidentiary threshold for prosecution could not be met, the system failed to stop him. Cases like this expose the painful reality that investigators can sometimes know more than they can legally prove. Police may sense they are dealing with the correct offender while still lacking the evidence necessary to prevent release. For the detectives involved, Hardy's freedom must have carried a lingering sense of dread. If he truly was responsible for Wanda's murder, then a dangerous predator had just returned to the streets. Tragically, that fear proved justified. After Sharon Mosafa's murder in March 1976, the investigation entered an entirely different phase. Sharon's death intensified suspicions that Manchester was facing a serial offender. Detectives began examining similarities between the murders more aggressively. The victims shared key characteristics: teenage girls attacked while alone at night, extreme violence, and post-mortem mutilation. Patterns that once appeared uncertain now seemed increasingly undeniable. The emotional atmosphere inside the investigation changed accordingly. Detectives were no longer trying merely to solve separate violent crimes. They were attempting to stop an active killer before another attack occurred. Public pressure intensified further as details surrounding Sharon's murder emerged. The possibility that a suspect previously detained in connection with Wanda Scala's murder might still be involved created enormous scrutiny. Questions inevitably arose about whether Hardy should have remained in custody earlier. But criminal investigations rarely unfold with perfect clarity in real time. Detectives must work within legal standards, available evidence, and procedural limitations. Unfortunately, those limitations can produce irreversible consequences when confronting violent offenders. As investigators revisited earlier leads after Sharon's death, Hardy once again emerged as a central figure of suspicion. By now, the cumulative weight surrounding him had become difficult to ignore. His violent history, prior detention, behavioral instability, and possible connection to multiple victims formed an increasingly alarming profile. Detectives intensified surveillance and investigative efforts aimed at finally building a prosecutable case. Then, in August 1976, the investigation finally reached its breakthrough. Hardy was arrested again. This time, investigators obtained evidence far more damaging than before. During searches connected to the arrest, police discovered blood-stained clothing and Wanda Scala's handbag inside Hardy's home. The significance of those discoveries cannot be overstated. Physical possession of items linked directly to a murder victim represented powerful evidence, especially in an era before advanced forensic technology. The handbag in particular connected Hardy materially to Wanda's death in a way far more difficult to explain away. Investigators also viewed the retention of victim property as psychologically significant. In violent offender cases, trophies sometimes serve as reminders of crimes, objects allowing perpetrators to relive experiences privately after the murders themselves. Hardy's alleged retention of Wanda's belongings reinforced suspicions that his violence extended beyond impulsive rage into something more deeply predatory. Under renewed interrogation pressure, Hardy eventually confessed. The confessions transformed the investigation from circumstantial suspicion into confirmed horror. Hardy admitted responsibility not only for the murders of Wanda Scala and Sharon Mossoff, but also for Janet Stewart, whose disappearance had remained unresolved for nearly 2 years. For investigators, Janet's case represented a devastating revelation because until that moment, uncertainty still surrounded her fate. Families of missing persons often live inside impossible emotional contradictions, balancing fear against hope for years. Hardy's confession destroyed whatever hope remained for Janet's family. Yet, even then, investigators required verification. Confessions alone are not always reliable, particularly in high-profile criminal cases. What made Hardy's admissions especially powerful was his ability to lead police directly to Janet Stewart's burial site. Hardy guided investigators to the shallow grave where Janet's body had remained hidden since New Year's Eve 1974. That moment carried enormous emotional weight, not only for detectives, but also for Janet's family, who finally received confirmation of the truth after months of agonizing uncertainty. The recovery of Janet's body transformed the investigation permanently. Hardy now stood connected through confession, physical evidence, and recovered remains to multiple murders spanning nearly 2 years. As detectives assembled the case, they worked carefully to establish continuity between the crimes. Prosecutors needed to demonstrate not merely isolated acts of violence, but a consistent pattern of predatory behavior. The similarities between the murders became central to that effort. Teenage female victims, nighttime attacks, extreme violence, mutilation after death, the retention of victim property. Investigators increasingly viewed the crimes as manifestations of escalating aggression from a single offender who had grown more confident over time. Yet, even as the case strengthened, broader questions lingered in the background. How many opportunities had existed to stop Hardy earlier? Could Janet Stewart's murder have been connected more quickly if her body had been discovered sooner? Could Wanda Scala's death have prevented Sharon Mossoff's murder if forensic evidence had remained intact? Those questions haunted both investigators and the public because they touched on something deeply painful within criminal justice systems. The recognition that solving a case after multiple deaths is fundamentally different from preventing future victims. The Trevor Hardy investigation also exposed the fragile nature of forensic confidence during the 1970s. Bite mark analysis, once treated as promising evidence, ultimately failed to secure Hardy's early detention. Decades later, forensic science would evolve dramatically, and some bite mark methodologies would face serious criticism regarding reliability. But during the Hardy investigation, detectives were working with the best tools available to them at the time. The failure did not stem from indifference. It stemmed from technological limitation colliding with a violent offender willing to manipulate evidence physically to escape prosecution. Public reaction to Hardy's confession reflected both relief and anger. Relief because Manchester finally knew the identity of the man responsible for terrorizing communities and murdering teenage girls. Anger because many people believed at least one victim might still be alive had the investigation succeeded earlier. Cases involving serial violence often produce that painful mixture of emotions. Capturing the offender ends immediate danger, but also crystallizes irreversible loss. For the families of Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosoff, the investigation's breakthrough did not restore stolen futures. It simply replaced uncertainty with confirmed tragedy. Meanwhile, detectives continued exploring whether Hardy might be responsible for additional crimes beyond the 3 confirmed murders. Violent offenders who escalate over time often generate suspicion regarding unsolved cases occurring within similar geographic areas or time periods. In Hardy's case, some community members and investigators later suspected possible involvement in the earlier death of Dorothy Lydon in 1971. Requests were made years afterward to re-examine evidence through DNA testing, though results ultimately remained inconclusive. That lingering uncertainty contributed to the enduring unease surrounding Hardy's legacy. Serial murder investigations often leave behind unresolved shadows. Cases where suspicion exists without proof strong enough for certainty. By the time investigators completed the core case against Trevor Hardy, they had uncovered not a criminal mastermind carefully orchestrating impossible schemes, but something arguably more disturbing, a deeply violent, impulsive offender who repeatedly exploited gaps in the system long enough to continue killing. The investigation revealed both determined police work and devastating limitations. Detectives questioned tens of thousands of people, pursued forensic evidence aggressively, and eventually secured confessions tying Hardy directly to the crimes. Yet the same investigation also demonstrated how close authorities had come to stopping him earlier, and how catastrophic failure became once he slipped free. That contradiction remains central to understanding the Trevor Hardy case. It was not merely the story of a serial killer. It was also the story of an investigation racing desperately against time, against technological limits, and against the terrifying possibility that every delay might cost another young life. By the time Trevor Hardy entered Manchester Crown Court, fear had already transformed into something heavier and more permanent across the city. The uncertainty that once haunted investigators and grieving families had finally been replaced with a name, a face, and a confirmed chain of violence connecting the deaths of 3 teenage girls. Yet the courtroom proceedings were never simply about identifying the killer anymore. That question had largely been answered through physical evidence, confession, and Hardy's own guidance leading police to Janet Stewart's grave. Instead, the trial became about forcing the horror into public view, step by step, detail by detail, while families sat only a short distance away listening to the final reconstruction of how their daughters died. Courtrooms in murder cases often operate on 2 levels simultaneously. On one level, they are legal arenas governed by evidence, procedure, and argument. On another, they become emotional spaces where grief collides with public scrutiny. In the Trevor Hardy case, Both realities existed side by side. Prosecutors needed to establish a coherent narrative linking Hardy directly to each murder while dismantling any attempt by the defense to minimize responsibility. At the same time, the families of Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mossoff were forced to confront details most people could barely imagine enduring. Every crime scene description, every mention of mutilation, every timeline reconstruction transformed private loss into public record. The emotional atmosphere surrounding the proceedings reflected not only sorrow, but also anger. By the time of the trial, many people already understood that Hardy had previously been arrested and released during the investigation into Wanda Scala's murder. That fact hung heavily over the courtroom. It was impossible to ignore the implication that Sharon Mossoff might still be alive if earlier investigative efforts had succeeded. Although the trial itself focused on Hardy's crimes rather than institutional failures, the broader context remained unavoidable. For observers following the proceedings, the case represented not only the brutality of serial murder, but also the devastating consequences of investigative limitations during the 1970s. Prosecutors approached the case by emphasizing pattern and escalation. Individually, each murder revealed horrifying violence. Together, they painted the portrait of a repeat offender growing increasingly dangerous over time. Janet Stewart disappeared first, buried secretly in a shallow grave after being stabbed to death. Months later came Wanda Scala, whose murder displayed greater brutality and generated widespread public panic. Then came Sharon Mossoff, killed after Hardy had already escaped serious suspicion once before. Prosecutors sought to demonstrate that these were not isolated incidents of uncontrolled rage, but connected acts committed by a single violent predator repeatedly targeting vulnerable teenage girls. Hardy's defense attempted to reduce some of the charges to manslaughter rather than murder. That distinction mattered enormously in legal terms because manslaughter implies diminished intent or reduced culpability compared to deliberate homicide. But prosecutors rejected any suggestion that the killings represented spontaneous acts lacking murderous intent. The evidence instead pointed toward deliberate violence, concealment, and repeated predatory behavior. Hardy had not merely attacked his victims impulsively and panicked afterward. He buried Janet Stewart's body. He kept items connected to victims. He attempted to alter forensic evidence while in custody. Those actions suggested awareness, calculation, and efforts to evade responsibility rather than loss of control alone. One of the most emotionally devastating moments during the proceedings involved the discussion of Janet Stewart's disappearance and eventual recovery. For nearly 2 years, Janet's family had lived without certainty regarding her fate. Missing person cases create a psychological torment unlike almost any other form of grief because hope continues surviving long after logic begins collapsing. Families replay possibilities endlessly. Maybe she left voluntarily. Maybe someone is hiding her. Maybe she lost contact somehow. Hardy's confession had destroyed those hopes. But hearing the details publicly in court forced the final reality into irreversible focus. Prosecutors describe how Hardy led investigators to Janet's shallow grave near a school, revealing that she had been dead since the night she disappeared. The courtroom now confronted not only murder, but the prolonged cruelty of allowing a family to unknowingly live beside false hope for months. The evidence surrounding Wanda Scala's murder carried equal emotional weight. Prosecutors detailed how the 17-year-old had simply been walking home from work after finishing her shift at a hotel bar in Mostown. Her ordinary routine became central to the tragedy because it highlighted how random and predatory the attack truly was. Wanda was not targeted through prolonged personal conflict or complicated circumstance. She was vulnerable because she happened to be alone at night in the path of a violent offender. The prosecution also addressed the severe injuries and mutilation inflicted upon her body. Careful courtroom procedure required presenting forensic findings without sensationalism. But the brutality remained impossible to soften completely. Jurors were forced to confront the sheer violence involved in the attack, including the bite mark evidence that had once represented investigators' strongest forensic lead. The issue of Hardy altering his own teeth became one of the most shocking revelations discussed during the proceedings. According to the investigation, Hardy had secretly filed down his teeth while in custody after realizing police intended to compare his dentition to bite marks found on Wanda's body. That detail horrified observers because it revealed both consciousness of guilt and a desperate willingness to physically damage himself in order to obstruct the investigation. Prosecutors used this behavior to reinforce the argument that Hardy understood exactly what he had done and actively attempted to escape accountability afterward. It also reignited painful public discussion about how close investigators had come to stopping him. Earlier, had the dental evidence remained intact, prosecutors may have secured charges before Sharon Mossoff was killed, though the court could not answer hypothetical questions. The emotional reality lingered heavily over the trial. Sharon Mossoff's murder formed the final major component of the prosecution's case. Like the earlier victims, Sharon was only 17 years old. Prosecutors reconstructed her final movements from a night she attended a staff party before disappearing. Investigators believe Hardy may have killed Sharon because she encountered him while he attempted to break into a shopping center. If true, the motive suggested Hardy was now murdering not only from violent compulsion, but also to eliminate perceived threats. The prosecution emphasized the similarities linking Sharon's death to the earlier murders. Nighttime attack, teenage female victim, extreme violence, and mutilation after death. By establishing these repeated characteristics, prosecutors aimed to demonstrate a consistent behavioral pattern pointing unmistakably toward Hardy. The physical evidence recovered from Hardy's home further strengthened the prosecution's position. Police had discovered blood-stained clothing and Wanda Scala's handbag among his possessions. Possession of victim property often carries powerful psychological implications in serial murder cases because it suggests the offender wanted to preserve some connection to the crime afterward. Prosecutors presented the handbag not merely as stolen property, but as another link binding Hardy directly to Wanda's murder, combined with his confessions and the recovery of Janet Stewart's remains. The cumulative weight of the evidence became overwhelming. Yet even in the face of overwhelming evidence, trials involving serial killers often produce strange moments where the accused attempts to minimize responsibility or reshape public perception. Hardy reportedly tried to shift portions of his defense toward manslaughter arguments, seeking to reduce the level of intent associated with the murders. But the prosecution countered forcefully by highlighting the sustained pattern of violence and concealment, burying Janet's body, keeping trophies, attempting to destroy forensic evidence, repeatedly attacking vulnerable teenage girls. These were not actions consistent with temporary emotional collapse alone. They reflected ongoing predatory behavior extending across nearly 2 years. Throughout the proceedings, the victims' families endured the unbearable task of listening to the final reconstruction of their daughters' deaths while seated within the same courtroom as the man responsible. True crime narratives sometimes focus excessively on courtroom strategy or the psychology of offenders while unintentionally minimizing the emotional devastation experienced by relatives. But in reality, murder trials often reopen wounds rather than heal them. Families hear forensic details repeated publicly. They relive timelines. They confront photographs, testimony, and evidence that permanently redefine memories of the people they loved. For Janet Stewart's family, The trial confirmed that their daughter had not vanished into uncertainty, but died violently, while they spent months hoping for her return. For Wanda Scala's relatives, the proceedings forced public confrontation with the horrifying injuries inflicted upon her. For Sharon Mosaf's family, the trial underscored the possibility that her death might have been preventable had Hardy not escaped earlier custody. By the time closing arguments approached, the central issue before the court was no longer whether Trevor Hardy committed the murders. The evidence against him had become overwhelming. Instead, the proceedings focused on formally establishing responsibility for 3 of Manchester's most disturbing killings and ensuring Hardy would never again return to society. When the verdict finally arrived, Hardy was convicted and sentenced to 3 life terms for the murders of Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosaf. The court rejected attempts to reduce the crimes to manslaughter. Legally and morally, the murders were recognized as deliberate acts of extreme violence committed against vulnerable teenage girls. For Manchester, the convictions marked the end of a terrifying chapter. The killer who had haunted neighborhoods, dominated headlines, and spread fear throughout the city would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Yet the verdict did not erase the deeper scars left behind by the case. Public reaction after the sentencing reflected complicated emotions. Relief dominated immediate responses because Hardy could no longer harm anyone else. Communities that had spent years living with fear finally knew the man responsible was imprisoned permanently. But alongside relief came anger, frustration, and grief that no sentence could fully resolve. Many people remained haunted by the earlier investigative failures surrounding Wanda Scala's murder. Hardy had already been identified as a dangerous suspect once before. He had already come into police custody, and yet he was released. Sharon Mosaf's death now existed forever within the shadow of that failed opportunity. The trial also intensified broader conversations about forensic limitations during the 1970s. The bite mark evidence that initially seemed so promising had ultimately failed to secure Hardy's earlier prosecution. Modern forensic advances would later transform criminal investigations dramatically, but at the time detectives had worked within the boundaries of available science. That reality offered explanation, though not comfort. Cases like Hardy's exposed the painful truth that criminal justice systems are often judged not only by the offenders they convict, but also by the lives they fail to protect in time. After sentencing, Trevor Hardy disappeared into the British prison system, where he would remain for decades. But outside prison walls, the consequences of his crimes continued rippling through Manchester long after the courtroom emptied. Families carried grief into the following decades. Communities remembered the fear. Investigators reflected on the case with the uneasy awareness that they had once stood incredibly close to stopping him earlier. And the names Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosaf became permanently tied to one of the most disturbing murder investigations in Manchester's history. After the trial ended and Trevor Hardy disappeared behind prison walls, Manchester slowly attempted to return to normal life. But cities do not truly forget crimes like these. Even when headlines fade and courtrooms empty, certain cases remain embedded in collective memory because they alter the way people experience ordinary life. For many families across northern Manchester, the murders of Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosaf permanently changed how parents viewed nighttime streets, how young women moved through the city after dark, and how communities understood the possibility of violence existing close to home. Fear does not vanish immediately after an arrest. It lingers quietly inside habits people continue carrying for years afterward. Some parents who lived through the investigation reportedly remained overprotective long after Hardy's conviction. Women who grew up hearing about the murders remembered being warned never to walk alone at night. Entire neighborhoods retained memories of police patrols, newspaper headlines, and whispered conversations about missing girls. The emotional impact of serial violence rarely ends when a killer is sentenced. Instead, it settles into communities gradually, becoming part of local history passed between generations. Trevor Hardy himself would spend more than 35 years in prison, becoming one of Britain's longest-serving inmates. His life, after conviction, unfolded largely behind the isolation of the prison system, far removed from the fear he had once created across Manchester streets. Unlike some notorious offenders who continue seeking attention through interviews or public statements, Hardy gradually faded from national headlines over time. Yet the passage of years did not erase the severity of his crimes. For the families of his victims, the sentence was never about vengeance alone. It was about certainty that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another young woman. Hardy eventually died in 2012 at Wakefield Prison after suffering a heart attack. He was 67 years old. Reports following his death noted that some relatives of the victims publicly expressed relief upon learning that the man responsible for so much suffering was finally gone. That reaction is understandable, but it also reveals something important about the long-term reality of violent crime. Even decades later, families continued carrying emotional weight connected to Hardy's existence. His death represented the final closing of a chapter that had haunted them since the 1970s. Yet relief is not the same as healing. The deaths of Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosoff could never be undone. Time moves forward for surviving relatives, but grief often remains strangely fixed around the age victims were when they died. Janet would always remain 15 in memory. Wanda and Sharon would always remain 17. Their futures stopped permanently, while everyone else around them continued aging. One of the most enduring aspects of the Trevor Hardy case is the unresolved question surrounding whether there may have been additional victims beyond the 3 confirmed murders. Investigators and members of the public long suspected Hardy could have been responsible for more violence than prosecutors ultimately proved in court. This suspicion did not emerge from fantasy or sensationalism alone. Serial offenders who escalate over time frequently attract scrutiny regarding unsolved crimes, occurring within similar regions or time periods. In Hardy's case, attention eventually focused on the earlier death of Dorothy Lydon in 1971. Some community members and investigators believed similarities between the cases warranted further examination. Years later, calls were made to reopen aspects of the investigation and conduct modern DNA testing in hopes of determining whether Hardy could be definitively linked to Dorothy Lydon's death. However, the results remained inconclusive. That uncertainty left the question unresolved, suspended permanently between suspicion and proof. Cases like this often produce lingering shadows where absolute certainty never arrives. There may be crimes investigators strongly suspect an offender committed but cannot conclusively prove. There may also be victims who remain entirely unknown. The truth is that some violent offenders leave behind incomplete histories impossible to fully reconstruct decades later. In Hardy's case, the possibility of additional victims contributed to the lasting unease surrounding his legacy. If 3 murders were all he committed, the violence was already horrifying. If there were more, then parts of the story may still remain buried within the past. Yet focusing solely on the killer risks missing the deeper significance of the case itself. The Trevor Hardy investigation exposed not only the brutality of one violent offender, but also the vulnerability created by social and investigative limitations during the 1970s. The victims were young women navigating ordinary routines in an environment where late-night travel often meant walking alone through poorly lit streets with minimal protection. Their vulnerability was not the result of reckless choices. It was the result of everyday life intersecting with predatory violence. At the same time, the investigation revealed how limited forensic science could be before the rise of modern DNA analysis. Detectives worked tirelessly, questioning tens of thousands of people and pursuing every available lead. Yet critical evidence remained fragile. The bite mark analysis that once appeared capable of identifying Wanda Scala's killer ultimately failed after Hardy reportedly altered his own teeth. Today, many people hearing that detail for the first time react with disbelief. The idea that a suspect could physically manipulate forensic evidence so directly feels almost surreal. But it happened within a period when criminal investigations depended heavily on methods far less reliable than modern standards. Hardy exploited those weaknesses successfully, at least temporarily. That failure became one of the most haunting aspects of the case because it created the possibility that Sharon Mosaf's murder might have been prevented. This question has followed the investigation for decades. Could police have stopped Hardy sooner? Could another teenager have survived if the evidence against him after Wanda Scala's murder had held together more strongly? There is no answer capable of bringing comfort because counterfactual history offers only painful speculation. Investigators can reconstruct missed opportunities endlessly without ever changing the outcome. Yet those missed opportunities matter because they shape how future cases are handled. Criminal justice systems often evolve through tragedy. Failures expose weaknesses. Weaknesses create reform. Cases like Hardy's contributed to broader conversations about forensic reliability, evidence preservation, and the importance of connecting violent crimes through behavioral patterns rather than viewing them as isolated incidents. The emotional legacy of the murders also forces reflection on how society remembers victims of violent crime. Serial killer cases frequently become dominated by the identities and myths surrounding offenders, especially when the media assigns dramatic nicknames like the Beast of Manchester. But sensational labels can unintentionally overshadow the people whose lives were actually stolen. Janet Stewart was not merely the first victim in a serial murder timeline. She was a 15-year-old girl whose family spent months waiting for her return. Wanda Scala was not simply a forensic case involving bite marks and investigative failure. She was a teenager finishing a work shift and trying to make it home safely. Sharon Mosaf was not only the final confirmed victim. She was a young woman attending a staff party before encountering fatal violence on her journey home. Remembering the victims as individuals rather than narrative devices matters deeply in cases like this because true crime storytelling can sometimes drift toward fascination with offenders instead of empathy for those harmed by them. Trevor Hardy's life itself offers little worthy of mythologizing. He was not a criminal genius orchestrating elaborate schemes. He was a violent man with a long history of aggression who repeatedly escaped permanent consequences until multiple girls were already dead. That reality may actually be more frightening than the fictionalized image of an evil mastermind, because it reveals how dangerous ordinary brutality can become when warning signs go unaddressed. Hardy's escalation was visible. He had a record of assaults. He frightened people. He attacked a man with a pickaxe before the murders even began. Yet he continued moving through society until his violence evolved into serial killing. Cases like this challenge comforting assumptions that truly dangerous individuals are always obvious, in ways institutions immediately recognize and stop. Often, the reality is far messier. Warning signs exist, but systems fail to connect them quickly enough. Communities notice troubling behavior, but no single incident seems sufficient to predict future horror. By the time the pattern becomes undeniable, irreversible damage has already occurred. Manchester itself changed enormously in the decades following Hardy's crimes. Neighborhoods evolved. Industrial decline reshaped parts of the city. New generations grew up with little awareness of the fear that once dominated local headlines during the mid-1970s. Some locations connected to the case transformed physically over time, making it difficult for younger residents to imagine the atmosphere that once existed there. Yet for those who lived through the investigation, the memory remained vivid. They remembered the warnings about walking home alone. They remembered police questioning thousands of people. They remembered the growing realization that a serial killer was operating inside their city. They remembered how ordinary routines suddenly felt dangerous. And perhaps most of all, they remembered the girls. Cases involving violence against young women often provoke especially deep cultural fear because they attack the sense of safety attached to ordinary life. Janet Stewart disappeared during a holiday evening when families expected celebration. Wanda Scala vanished after work. Sharon Mosoff disappeared after a party. None of these circumstances appeared extraordinary beforehand. That ordinariness is exactly what makes the crimes feel so haunting decades later. The victims were not drawn into danger through complicated criminal worlds or risky conspiracies. They were living normal lives. In the end, the Trevor Hardy case remains disturbing not only because of the murders themselves, but because of everything surrounding them, the missed opportunity to stop him earlier, the limitations of forensic science, the vulnerability of young women forced to navigate isolated streets at night, and the lingering possibility that the full extent of Hardy's violence may never be completely known. Yet if there is one final truth worth holding on to in stories like this, it is that the victims deserve to be remembered longer than the killer. The nickname, the Beast of Manchester, became part of newspaper history. But names like Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosoff represent something far more important. They were real young women whose lives ended violently and far too soon. Families lost daughters. Communities lost a sense of safety. And 3 futures disappeared into the darkness of Manchester nights during the 1970s. Trevor Hardy died in prison after decades behind bars. But the consequences of his crimes outlived him. They remain in memories, in unresolved questions, and in the quiet realization that some tragedies continue echoing through generations long after the man responsible is gone.